You step off the boat without a tank on your back, no mask fogging up, no mouthpiece clenched between your teeth, just you, the surface breaking over your head, and then, for the first time in human history, nothing changing at all. You keep breathing. 20 feet down, 100 feet down. The reef spreads out beneath you in full color, the light bending blue and gold through the water, and your lungs never once ask you to go back up. What would actually have to change inside your body for that moment to be real? Let's start with the number that makes this whole idea so much harder than it sounds. Air is roughly 21% oxygen. Water, even the most oxygen-rich water on Earth, holds somewhere between 5 and 10 milliliters of dissolved oxygen per liter, compared to roughly 210 milliliters of oxygen in the same volume of air. That's a difference of nearly 30 times. So breathing underwater isn't just a matter of growing a slit behind your ear and calling it a day. It's a matter of somehow extracting 30 times more oxygen from the same volume of fluid, fast enough, constantly enough, to keep a human-sized brain and a human-sized set of muscles alive. What kind of organ could possibly do that? Fish solve this problem with gills, thin folds of tissue packed with blood vessels, spread across an enormous surface area and constantly bathed in fresh water flowing in one direction. A single fish gill can have a surface area many times larger than the fish's entire body. Human lungs, by comparison, are optimized for air, which is thin, easy to move, and oxygen-rich enough that a relatively modest surface area gets the job done. To pull enough oxygen from water to sustain a resting adult human, you need a respiratory surface dramatically larger than anything currently folded into a human chest cavity. Where would that surface even go? Wrapped around the ribs like a second skin, spread across the entire back, gill slits fluttering along the spine like something out of a nightmare crossed with a nature documentary. The math doesn't care how strange the answer looks. It only cares whether the surface area exists. Here's where real science actually gets you partway there, and it's been sitting inside the human body this whole time. In the 1940s, the physiologist Per Scolander studied what happens to the bodies of diving mammals, seals, whales, and eventually humans when they're submerged. Scolander documented what's now called the mammalian dive reflex, a set of automatic responses triggered the instant your face hits cold water. Your heart rate drops, sometimes by 10 to 25% almost immediately. Blood vessels in your limbs constrict, redirecting oxygen-rich blood away from your arms and legs and toward your heart and brain, the organs that need it most. Elite freedivers today can push this reflex further than almost anyone thought possible, holding their breath for minutes at a time, diving hundreds of feet on a single lungful of air. Your body, it turns out, already half remembers how to survive underwater. The question is whether half a memory is enough or whether it would take a wholesale redesign to finish the job. That question isn't purely theoretical either, because scientists have actually tried to solve part of it directly. In the late 1960s, the physiologist Johannes Kilstra ran a series of experiments on liquid breathing, submerging mice, and later testing the concept on dogs and eventually human volunteers, using oxygen-saturated perfluorocarbon liquid instead of air. The liquid could hold enough dissolved oxygen to sustain life, and lungs could, in principle, absorb it the way they absorb air. Mice survived, at least for a while, fully submerged and breathing liquid instead of gas. But the human volunteers ran into a brutal physical wall. Human lungs are built to inflate and exhale a light, low-viscosity gas. Liquid is roughly 1,000 times denser than air, and human diaphragm muscles, no matter how strong, simply couldn't move enough of it in and out fast enough to clear carbon dioxide from the bloodstream. Volunteers survived the experience, but only briefly and only with real physical strain. Kilstra's work proved liquid breathing was chemically possible. It also proved, painfully, that the human body as it currently exists isn't built for the mechanics of it. So if humans could breathe underwater, would evolution actually need to give us gills at all, or would it need to redesign the entire pumping mechanism of the chest first? Now picture the version of this world where evolution or genetic engineering actually solved both problems at once. A hybrid respiratory organ, part lung, part gill, capable of switching between air and water depending on which one you're currently surrounded by. You surface, take a breath the old-fashioned way, then submerge and the same organ reconfigures itself, unfolding extra surface area, slowing your heart rate automatically the way Scolander's freedivers already do, and beginning to strip oxygen out of the water around you instead. What would that transition actually feel like? A held breath's worth of panic before the new system kicks in, or something as smooth and unconscious as blinking? There's a strange, related clue buried in a different part of human biology: and it comes from a small population of sea nomads in Southeast Asia known as the Moken. The vision researcher Anna Gislaine studied Moken children who spend enormous amounts of time diving for shellfish and sea cucumbers without any equipment and found something remarkable. These children can see clearly underwater, roughly twice as well as European children tested under the same conditions, by consciously constricting their pupils and adjusting the lens shape of their eyes in ways adult humans rarely manage. Gislaine's research suggested this wasn't a genetic difference at all, but a trainable adaptation, something European children could also learn to do with enough practice. If human vision can rewire itself that dramatically within a single childhood, purely through repeated exposure, how much of the rest of what you'd need to breathe underwater might already be sitting latent inside human biology, waiting for the right evolutionary or technological push? Let's say the biology actually works. Gills, hybrid lungs, whatever the mechanism, and you can now breathe underwater as easily as you breathe air. The very first thing you'd notice within seconds has nothing to do with oxygen at all. It's the cold. Water conducts heat away from the human body roughly 25 times faster than air does. A person swimming in 70-degree water, warm enough to feel pleasant on a beach vacation, can develop hypothermia within hours if they stay submerged long enough. Breathing underwater doesn't solve that problem. It might actually make it worse, since a gill-like organ constantly circulating water through your body would be circulating cold directly past your bloodstream, over and over every single breath. Would this new version of humanity need an entirely new layer of insulation just to survive comfortably, something closer to blubber than skin? And if it did, what would that do to how we look, how we move, how we recognize each other at a glance? Then there's pressure, which gets more dangerous the deeper you go, in ways that have nothing to do with your lungs at all. Every 33 feet of depth adds roughly 1 additional atmosphere of pressure pressing in on your body. Scuba divers already have to manage nitrogen dissolving into their blood and tissues under that pressure, and ascending too quickly lets that nitrogen come out of solution as bubbles, a condition called decompression sickness, or the bends, first seriously studied by physiologists working on deep-sea and caisson workers in the late 1800s and early 1900s. If your lungs were replaced with something permanently exchanging gas with the water around you, would that actually make decompression sickness worse, since you'd never truly have a moment of surfacing to slowly off-gas the way divers do today? Or could a redesigned respiratory system somehow manage nitrogen exchange more gracefully than the crude one humans currently have? Nobody has ever had to answer that question for real, because nobody has ever had a permanently submerged respiratory system to test it on. Assume, for the sake of the thought experiment, that all of this gets solved. The gills work, the cold is manageable, the pressure problem gets engineered away. What does the world actually look like a generation after that? Start with the ocean itself, because more than 80% of it remains unexplored and unmapped, deeper and more alien than the surface of Mars in some places. Entire ecosystems exist around hydrothermal vents in complete darkness, running on chemical energy instead of sunlight, discovered only in 1977 and still being cataloged today. A species that could breathe underwater wouldn't just be able to visit these places briefly with a submersible and a spotlight. People could live near them, study them for years instead of hours. An entire branch of science currently constrained by how long a person can hold their breath, how much air a tank can carry, or how much a submersible costs to operate, would suddenly have something researchers have never had before: unlimited time. Cities would follow, almost certainly, though probably not the sleek glass domes of science fiction. Continental shelves, the relatively shallow water extending out from every coastline before the ocean floor drops away into the deep abyss, cover an enormous amount of space currently used for almost nothing except shipping lanes and fishing. If humans could live comfortably underwater, that space becomes real estate in the most literal sense. Coastal nations already fighting over shrinking land as sea levels rise might suddenly find themselves sitting on an entirely new frontier, just a few dozen feet beneath the waves they used to fear. Would underwater cities feel like an escape from the crowding and heat of a warming surface world, or would they just import all the same problems, inequality, pollution, overcrowding, into a new and stranger set of coordinates? Food changes too, in ways that ripple out from something as simple as no longer needing boats to fish. Aquaculture, already one of the fastest growing food industries on the planet, would transform completely if farmers could simply live alongside their crops instead of managing them remotely from the surface. Kelp forests, already recognized as one of the most efficient carbon-capturing ecosystems on Earth, could be farmed at a scale currently unimaginable, tended directly by people who never need to surface for air. Some researchers studying blue carbon, the carbon captured by ocean and coastal ecosystems, have suggested that scaled-up kelp farming alone could meaningfully offset a portion of global emissions. Would a species that could breathe underwater end up solving part of its own climate crisis almost by accident, simply because the easiest place to grow food happened to also be one of the best places to store carbon? There's a darker thread running through all of this too, the same one that shows up whenever humans get access to a new frontier. Territorial disputes over land have shaped nearly all of recorded history. What happens when the disputed territory triples in size overnight, stretching out across continental shelves that 6 different countries might claim simultaneously? International waters currently operate under agreements like the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, treaties written by people who never imagined citizens actually living, working, and voting from beneath the surface. Would existing maritime law even survive contact with a species that no longer needs a boat to occupy the ocean? Or would an entirely new legal framework need to be built from scratch, the same way aviation law had to be invented almost from nothing once humans first learned to fly? Military strategy would shift too, in ways that sound almost absurd until you actually sit with them. Submarines exist today specifically because humans can't survive unprotected underwater, requiring an enormous pressurized hull just to keep a crew alive. A species that could breathe water directly wouldn't need that hull at all for many operations. Underwater infrastructure, communication cables, pipelines, ports, currently sits relatively undefended because almost nobody can reach it easily or stay there long. Would coastal nations end up building underwater border patrols the same way they currently build coast guards? And would the ocean floor, largely lawless and unclaimed today, become the next contested frontier the way the Arctic has slowly become one as its ice retreats? Sports and culture would transform in stranger, gentler ways too. Swimming as an Olympic event would need an entirely new category or possibly several, since racing underwater without needing to surface for air changes the entire physics of competitive swimming. Music, currently impossible to experience the way it travels through air, would sound completely different underwater, since sound moves roughly 4.5 times faster through water than through air, and travels much farther with much less energy loss. Whales already use this property to communicate across entire ocean basins. Would humans capable of breathing underwater eventually develop something like whale song of their own, low, resonant communication designed specifically for a medium where sound behaves like nothing on land? There's an older idea worth mentioning here too, even though it remains firmly contested among scientists. In the 1960s, the marine biologist Alistair Hardy proposed what became known as the aquatic ape hypothesis. The idea that early human ancestors spent a significant evolutionary period wading and foraging in shallow water, which might help explain traits like reduced body hair, subcutaneous fat distribution, and a naturally present dive reflex that most land mammals don't share. The hypothesis has never gained mainstream acceptance among paleoanthropologists, and most consider the fossil evidence for it thin at best. But the fact that the idea has persisted for over 60 years, repeatedly debated and repeatedly rejected and repeatedly brought back up again, says something about how tantalizingly close humans already seem to a world we never quite entered. Maybe breathing underwater wouldn't be some radical departure from what humans are. Maybe it would just be finishing a sentence evolution started writing millions of years ago and then, for reasons still not fully understood, abandoned halfway through. There's also a generational question buried inside all of this, and it might matter more than any of the engineering. If this ability arrived through genetic modification rather than gradual evolution, the first generation to receive it would essentially be adults retrofitted with an organ their brain never grew up expecting. Learning to control a hybrid gill lung, consciously managing the switch between air and water the way Scolander's freedivers consciously trigger part of the dive reflex, might take years of deliberate practice, closer to learning a second language as an adult than remembering how to walk. Children born with the trait already built in, on the other hand, might never experience it as a skill at all. The way a child raised bilingual never experiences translation as effortful thinking, a child born breathing water might simply never register the switch between air and ocean as a switch in the first place. Within 2 or 3 generations, would there even be a meaningful line left between people who think of themselves as land-based and people who think of themselves as amphibious? Or would that distinction simply dissolve the way distinctions between other traits eventually blur across a population? There's a psychological shift worth sitting with too, separate from all the biology and infrastructure. An enormous number of people currently experience thalassophobia, a deep, instinctive fear of large bodies of water and whatever might be moving unseen beneath the surface. Some researchers who study specific phobias link this fear partly to an evolved caution around deep water, a reasonable inheritance from millions of years of ancestors who couldn't breathe there and could easily drown. Remove the drowning risk entirely, permanently, and does that fear fade on its own within a generation or two, the way fears tend to fade once the actual danger behind them disappears? Or does something else entirely take its place, some new unease about a world that's now accessible but still vast, still dark in its deepest parts, still hiding more of itself than any single human, however capable, could ever fully explore in one lifetime? Think about what identity even means at that point. Humans have spent the entirety of recorded history defining themselves partly by what separates them from the rest of the animal kingdom: walking upright, complex language, tool use, an enormous brain relative to body size. Add the ability to breathe underwater to that list, something every fish and amphibian already does effortlessly, and does it diminish that sense of separation? Or does it just add one more entry to an already impossibly long list of things that make humans unusually adaptable? A species that can survive comfortably on land and underwater simultaneously starts to look less like a single kind of animal and more like two overlapping ones, sharing a body, a mind, and a single continuous stretch of memory between the two worlds. There's an economic ripple worth tracing too, one that starts small and ends up touching almost everything. The global shipping industry currently spends enormous sums inspecting and repairing underwater infrastructure using remotely operated vehicles and highly trained, tank-limited divers working in short shifts against the clock. A workforce that could simply live and work underwater indefinitely would collapse those costs dramatically, the same way remote work collapsed certain office costs once video calls became reliable enough to replace commuting. Marine salvage, offshore construction, underwater archaeology, currently some of the most expensive and dangerous fields in the world specifically because of how briefly a human body can tolerate the environment, would suddenly become closer in cost and risk to ordinary construction work on land. Tourism would shift too in a direction that's almost impossible to overstate. Right now, only a small, wealthy, and specifically trained fraction of the population ever sees a coral reef up close, briefly, through a mask before their air runs low. Remove that ceiling entirely and ocean tourism might eventually dwarf everything currently built around beaches and boardwalks, since the actual product being sold, unlimited, unhurried time inside one of the most visually stunning environments on the planet, would finally be something almost anyone could access. Medicine would absorb some of the shock too, in ways that reach back onto dry land. Understanding exactly how a redesigned human respiratory system managed gas exchange, blood oxygenation, and thermal regulation underwater would almost certainly produce spillover knowledge relevant to lung disease, hypothermia treatment, and even certain surgical techniques that already rely on controlled body cooling. Every major shift in what a human body can do has historically taught doctors something unexpected about what a human body already does, and there's little reason to think a working set of human gills would be any different. There's a quieter version of this question too, one that has nothing to do with cities, law, evolution, or economics, and everything to do with a single ordinary afternoon. Right now, the ocean is something humans visit: a vacation, a dive certification, a brief, breathless window measured in tank pressure and dive tables, always shadowed by the countdown of how much air is left. What happens to a species' relationship with an entire three-quarters of its own planet once that countdown simply disappears? Does the ocean stop feeling foreign, dangerous, other, the way it has for the entire span of human history? Or does something get lost in that transition too? The specific electric fear of a place that could kill you the moment you stop paying attention, replaced by something calmer, more permanent, and maybe a little less awe-inspiring simply because it's no longer forbidden. You step off the boat without a tank on your back and you keep breathing. Not because the ocean changed to meet you halfway. Because somewhere between Skollender's dive reflex, Kilstra's failed liquid lungs, and a Moken child learning to see clearly through salt water, the outline of that possibility was quietly waiting inside you the entire time.